Hello and welcome to A Renewed Republic. I'm your host, Rocky, and I have to apologize. I haven't got a video out recently. It's been a crazy couple weeks at work, and my wife was out of town, which left me rolling mostly solo with the three kiddos, and so some things that I wanted to do just didn't get done. So we're here today. We're going to talk about one of my favorite topics, something that's really important and near and dear to me, something I have a ton of belief in and something I'm passionate about. Before we get into that though, thank you for watching. If you're enjoying this content, if you like the idea of what a renewed republic stands for, please like and subscribe to the channel. But most importantly, as I always say, please consider sharing this with your friends and your family. Get that conversation going in your own homes. And let's get people excited about the things, the type of platform we need to build. And that's something I'm going to talk about first in this video. I realized that I kind of fell into the trap of responding to current events and the things that are happening in the world today. And it's really easy to do. There's a lot of things happening that we can be upset and pissed off about, whether you're talking about the National Guard troops deploying into Chicago and into Portland, or if you're talking about the speeches that President Trump and Pete Hegseth have given with respect to the military and changes at the Department of War. There's a lot of things that we can complain about, but ultimately the reason I started this channel was to start talking about solutions. Finding problems is easy. Everybody can find problems. We need to start talking about solutions. How do we fix these issues before we get to the point of fascism, before we get to the point where we allow President Trump and the people in his administration to continue to erode our civil rights and liberties? So with that being said, the thing I want to talk about today is the first core pillar of the party platform that I truly believe in, that I think that the Democratic Party should run on. And when you look around the Democratic Party, the reason I'm saying these things is because there's no excitement. With the exception of, I would say, AOC and Bernie Sanders, there's very little excitement. And even when, there's times when I see Pete Buttigieg, and I think he is really wonderful on camera, and there are some times where I'm really inspired by him, and there are other times where he reminds me of the old guard. And so we need to move away from that. We need to have a party platform that is the people-centric, and we need to control the narrative and the branding of that platform. It is not radical to want to have health care for every person in this country without having close to a million people every year go bankrupt from healthcare expenses and costs. That's not a radical thing. And the fact that we've allowed the Republican Party in particular to control the narrative about the radical left is absurd. There is no radical left party in America. Even when you look at Bernie Sanders and AOC, they are not radical leftists. They are not communists. They are not socialists even. And I think we need to own that narrative and that branding. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is the soil. Great nations rise and fall on the health of their soil. If you go through history, the Romans knew this. Their own writers warned about what it was going to mean for exhausted fields and deforestation. They talked about erosion. They talked about the danger of land consolidation. Into fewer and fewer hands, the wealthier become even more wealthy, because ultimately what that leads to is a failure of stewardship. And when that happens, resiliency fails as well. If we look at our own American history and we go back a century to President Teddy Roosevelt, he talked about conservation as the weightiest problem now before the nation when he was president. And he also warned that wasteful exploitation would exhaust America's resources. And he was right. Fast forward to 1937 and you have FDR, and he was even more plain about it. The nation that destroys its soil destroys itself. He wrote that in a letter urging governors to adopt uniform soil conservation laws, which that was after the Dust Bowl. So when we think about soil, you might be looking at me and you might be saying, like, what are you talking about soil? How is this a political platform? And here's the thing about it. The thing about soil is that it's a unique opportunity to bring a lot of people from of wide backgrounds together onto one subject, because it influences, frankly, every single person in this country. When you think about the most important jobs that people do in this country, I would say the most important job that we have is farming and ranching. I need a farmer. Everybody needs a farmer or a rancher. Minimum one time a day if you're only eating one meal a day. Most Americans obviously want to eat 3 meals a day. That food is grown, produced, packaged through that whole system. And right now that system is broken. And I think the beauty of saying that that system is broken is that you're going to have agreement across the political spectrum when you say that. When you talk about farming, when you talk about ranching, and you talk about the industrial production of food, there's a lot of people who will agree that it is the way that it's being done and carried out today is largely wrong. And there's a huge resurgence, maybe not huge, but there is a resurgence that I am seeing in my community. I'm part of this resurgence where I want to know where my food is raised. I want to know what practices they deploy. And so terms like regenerative ranching, regenerative farming, regenerative agriculture, those are becoming more common terms, and rightfully so. And that should give us hope for the future for food production. More and more people now are realizing the dangers of having an industrialized food production system, not only because that's a way where food is produced in an unsafe environment potentially. You look at the video from some of the hog farms and chicken farms that are corporate, and it is nothing short of disturbing. However, if you go out to your local farm, I think I've said before, I'm in Portland, Oregon. We're surrounded by excellent growing opportunities. You go out to a ranch in Hillsboro or Beaverton, even in some cases. You can go out to ranches in Eastern Oregon and Central Oregon, and you can see what a real working ranch should look like and how animals should be raised and how they should be treated. And this is not a political football. And what I mean by that is when you talk to ranchers about why they care about their animals or how they care about their animals, it's a deep connection to those animals. It's a deep connection to the soil. And that's very different than how animals are treated in the industrial food production system. And obviously the reason that industrial food production system developed the way it did is because capitalism. And I'm not going to sit here and say capitalism is bad. I am a capitalist. However, what I am going to say is that too much of anything is bad. And that is where we are at with capitalism right now. Some people refer to that as late stage capitalism. Sure, that's fine. We can go ahead and say that. I don't really care. What I do know is that we need to reinvent or reimagine how we think about capitalism, and in particular, how we do that with our food system. Okay, so okay, so where are we today then when we talk about topsoil? Like, what's the current status? Where we are right now is we are losing more than 5 tons of topsoil per acre every year. That's a lot of topsoil. And if you're not familiar with how growing works, topsoil is incredibly important. It's where a lot of the nutrients exist. It's really what allows plants to take root into the soil. And when we talk about the Dust Bowl happened in part because of the stripping of nutrients from the topsoil, and because it didn't have those nutrients, there was nothing holding it together. And you might say, well, what do you mean holding it together? If you take a scoop of healthy soil, a lot of people refer to this as like chocolate cake, because that's kind of what it looks like. Really high quality soil. It's really carbon rich. Soil is a carbon sink when you manage it properly. But when you take that handful of soil this big, there are more microorganisms in a handful of soil this big than there are people on the planet. Billions of microorganisms. Healthy soil is full of life. It's bacteria, microorganisms like I mentioned. There's fungi. There's all sorts of things that are happening inside that soil to build an ecosystem and to transport nutrients from one place to another. And that's what we want to use to grow. And that's what we want to build. So how do you build it? Well, the most traditional way of building it is by using a rotational crop system compounded with animals and bringing their urine and droppings to enrich the soil. That is probably the best way to do it if we think about this purely from a regenerative standpoint. And that's how the vast majority of farms operated prior to the end of World War II. And really the end of World War II is when we start getting, well, we have all these factories from building bombs and tanks and chemicals. And the companies looked at that and said, well, what can we use these chemicals for? And it turns out that a lot of those chemicals, nitrogen, ammonia, and others, can be used as fertilizers, as pesticides, as herbicides, as insecticides. And anytime you hear the word cide, C-I-D-E, that is Latin. It's derived from Latin for death. So when you say insecticide, that kills insects. When you say fungicide, that kills fungus. When you say herbicide, that kills plants. And so now we have this situation where the soil is being amended heavily every year, and it's actually killing the natural organisms that should exist in the soil. So when you think about that, just remember, soil isn't just dirt. It's a living system. Billions of microbes, the fungi, the insects, the roots, they all work together. They hold water, they store carbon, and ultimately that's what you want to grow food in. So if you kill that, you start killing resilience. And if you kill resilience, what do you need to do? We need to drop on more chemicals. It's that simple. It is a terrible system. And as a country, what do we need to do? Well, we need to incentivize farmers and ranchers to return back to a regenerative agricultural practice. We're going to get into how we do that. So where's the opportunity? And I'm going to be reading off some of my notes here because I've been thinking about this a lot and I want to make sure I get it right here. We need to flip the tone. I mentioned earlier that when we talk about soil, the reason I get excited about it is because not just because I really prefer grass-fed beef, which I do. I get excited about it because it impacts everybody. And because when you talk to anybody on the street, left, right, doesn't matter who, anybody, and you start talking about food, you can find an enormous amount of consensus. And when you go to scientists and you say, what's the climate benefit to regenerative farming? And there are farms and ranches that have done environmental impact studies when they flip back to regenerative agriculture and they find that their farm or their ranch becomes carbon neutral, and in some cases a carbon sink, and in some cases it's not neutral, there's still a carbon deficit, but it's massively improved. And so you have this opportunity to pull people and talk about climate change and impacting climate change by actually really incentivizing these American farmers and ranchers to adopt these principles. As a side note here, I can't remember the documentary, but there is a documentary out there that does a really good job showing what it looks like in terms of carbon release over the United States around June. And the reason for that is because all of the farmers and ranchers are tilling their land. And when you're tilling up the land, you're releasing a ton of carbon that is trapped in the soil. So if we can incentivize farmers to plant cover crops and to use technology that is less disruptive to breaking up the soil, if we can incentivize people to keep the carbon in the soil, that is good for climate change, obviously. It is also good for retaining water. And so when we think about being able to retain water, well, why is that important? Well, it's important because then in drought seasons, your crops are more resilient to drought because there's more water content per acre in that land. Additionally, when you get too much rain, because your soil is resilient, because it can be so absorbent, because it has all this carbon in it, and when you have that carbon, there's little pieces, like each piece of carbon potentially has these like nooks and crannies, and it creates surface area that is much larger than what would you have if it was just dirt, for example. And what that means is that it can store water. And so when you have an enormous amount of rainfall all at once that would typically cause flooding and runoff and erosion, that water can actually be absorbed back into the land, not only making it less resilient for drought season, but then also recharging the aquifers if you do this over a longer period of time. There's a really wonderful ranch, I believe it's White Oak Pastures out in Georgia. I cannot remember the guy who owns the ranch. He's an older gentleman, and I've listened to him on several podcasts. And despite how you may feel about Joe Rogan, and my feelings are mixed on the man, but he had him on his podcast, and it was such a wonderful conversation. I highly encourage everybody to go listen to it, because this man really understands the land, and owns a huge ranch in Georgia, in Bluffton, Georgia, I believe, and they have built this community around the ranch, and we need more of that, and we need more small town America doing those types of things. And even here in Oregon, in Portland, there is a farm called Topaz Farm. It's about 40 minutes outside of downtown, maybe even a little bit closer than that, and they have become a very successful regenerative ranch, because not only are they growing food, but they're hosting events. They're getting more people engaged from the community into that place, and understanding how they operate and getting excited about that. They have music come out, they have bands play, they have local beer and food on tap. It's an awesome place to build community, and I think ranches and farms have a unique opportunity to be able to do those things, because we're all connected to food. We all have to eat, and we all want our kids eating healthy food. We all want to eat healthy food. And when we look at the rise in cancer, for example, when we look at the rise in obesity, I think it's really easy to look at the food system that we are currently engaged with. And I think this is one thing that a lot of people were excited about initially with the MAHA movement, and I was too, because they were talking a lot about these things. Now, granted, I think that has gone off the rails in a very negative way, but I think we do need to come back to this central core tenet of being engaged with our food system, understanding where that food comes from, and supporting those local ranchers, local farmers, and ensuring that we build resiliency inside that system. So how do we do this? Well, we can create federal land trusts for new farmers. Farming is not a popular job. Ranching is not a popular job. It's hard work. Over the last 20, 30, 40 years, it's become incredibly difficult to make a good living doing it. And so what we need to do is incentivize new farmers. We need smart people moving into farming and ranching. And, all the farmers I've known and ranchers who I've met, they're just this really interesting mix of intelligent men and women who want to get their hands dirty, and they stand for something. I just have a tremendous amount of respect for these people. I get excited talking about it because I can't think of a better calling than growing food for the world, really. And so that's why I get excited about this subject matter. So let's create a federal land trust for new farmers. Let's get more people engaged in farming. Let's build relationships between farms and ranches and the schools where we can get kids involved and engaged in ranching and farming. Like, teach them the water cycle and the carbon cycle by getting their hands in the soil, helping the farmers grow food and plant crops, and start understanding like how this all builds together. There's a massive disconnect right now between people and their food, and we need to incentivize the closure of that gap. So we also need to redirect subsidies. Right now we subsidize a tremendous amount of soybean growth and corn growth. I don't want to say we should get rid of all of that, but we should certainly diversify those monocrops. Right now, like monocrop, farming, you're just leaving yourself open for invasive species and pests. Essentially requires that you use a lot of pesticides like Roundup, which has its own set of issues. We need to reallocate those subsidies, and we need to incentivize existing farmers to build resiliency in their ranches and their farms by, in part, stronger crop rotations, more diversity in the crops that they're growing, incorporating animals into those systems so they have their droppings and their urine that's then enriching the soil to continue to build the soil back. It's crazy important to do those things. So federal land trust, redirect subsidies, those are the first two. The third is tax incentives, cover crops, compost, rotational grazing. We can incentivize all of that through taxes. We can incentivize the building of communities that cooperate with one another, where you have ranchers and farmers who are each giving each other the waste of their product to enhance either their soil or their output. And there's ways that we can do that and incentivize it across the board, where you do this within a capitalistic system where everybody's going to benefit, including the consumer of those things. And then the other thing I would mention is we need to have apprenticeships and co-ops. And when I think about reimagining capitalism, to some degree, I think having a structure for companies that is kind of based off of a co-op structure where everybody is involved and responsible and has skin in the game, I'm a big fan of that, whether that's through direct equity or through phantom equity. I think there's a lot of ways that you can do that. But ultimately, what we have to do is we have to invest in our soil. We have to do those things. Really, when you think about it, politics in this country, they look a lot like our soil. It's overworked, it's over-extracted, it's controlled by a few people while everyone else is just trying to hang on and they're kind of along for the ride. Healthy soil is decentralized power. Think about it. Billions of organisms, each contributing, none dominating. It's self-regulating, it's resilient, it's fair. And those are some core tenets of what democracy ought to be. We can learn a lot by re-engaging with our soil. We can learn a lot from ourselves. We can learn a lot about our history. We can learn a lot about who we want to be by tending to our soil. Rebuilding the soil means restoring balance between people, between corporations, between cities and rural towns, between profit and purpose. I think it should be, in my mind, the foundation of every other reform should start with the soil. I mean, we just touched on the most important things to me from a party platform: economic fairness and opportunity, health and healthcare, education, and just democracy itself. So, plan and action. End soil mining, reward soil building. Keep food local, boost resilience. Right now, I believe on average, I heard this stat. I'm not sure if it's 100% accurate, but I heard a stat that on average, every bite of food consumed in the United States travels 1,500 miles from where it was grown or produced to where it is consumed. That's crazy. There's so many great technologies out there to not only build soil where we can plant plants in the ground and raise livestock. There's also other wonderful technologies to growing food indoors, hydroponic systems, aquaponic systems. And I don't think that those systems are the best, but they certainly are better than dumping a ton of pesticides and herbicides. And when it comes to feeding a growing population, and especially populations in urban environments, we should be taking advantage of those types of systems in those environments. Ultimately, what this boils down to is transitioning to a sustainable system. It can't be a shock collapse. And when I say transition, it can't just be all overnight. We can't just say, all right, ranchers and farmers, starting tomorrow or starting next month or starting next year, you're going from using pesticides to not using pesticides. It has to be a slow turn off. In a similar way, I'm going to compare this, it may be wrongfully, but I'm going to do it anyways. I'm going to compare it to alcoholism. A lot of people, you cannot just quit alcohol. It can kill you. And that's the same thing with the soil. If we just stop using pesticides and herbicides and insecticides, it's going to cause a massive issue in crop failure. We cannot have that. So we need to be smart about how we do this. And when we look at the soil, it's not just about what can we grow there. I mean, that's obviously a big question, but what other things should exist in that ecosystem? It's not just the billions and billions of organisms in the soil itself. It's also the life that should run abundant on the land. It should be about wetland recovery. It should be about reforestation and healthy forests that are budding up and into these farmland. It's about having predators like hawks and vultures who can then take advantage of that. Having mice and prey animals who are digging holes and disrupting soil in a positive way to help it grow. This is the greatest public resource that we have, is our soil. I don't think that's hyperbole. I think it is the most important public resource that we own. So this can't be a dream. This is the plan. And the reason I'm talking about soil first is because, like I said earlier, it is the bedrock upon which everything else is built. Every great civilization in history has had good soil and a way to feed its people as well as their armies so they could be successful, whether you agree with it or not, but successful with their conquest and conquering other people and other civilizations. And I don't think that we should devolve back to that type of warfare and that type of thinking. But we should recognize the importance of soil, the importance of the ability to grow food. So if you believe that our country, the United States of America, can be more than a consumer economy, if you believe that we can feed ourselves and the world, not the entire world, but we can help other countries and we can sell really high quality food to other countries, then it starts here. It starts with the very ground beneath your feet. It can even start with your own garden. You know, in World War II, we had victory gardens. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, they ended up accounting for, at their peak, close to 40% of the food produced in the country. As a country, we need to decide, what do we want to stand for? Who do we want to be? For me, it starts with soil. For me, it starts with feeding our kids great food. For me, it's making sure that they have the opportunity for their brains to develop in the best way possible. And what we know for a fact is it starts with nutrition. That's everything for today. I hope you enjoyed the content. I hope you enjoyed the show. We're going to talk more about soil. We're going to talk more about farming and agriculture. There's some really wonderful resources and documentaries I'd highly recommend that are available for either very low cost or for free. A couple of those documentaries that I highly recommend are Kiss the Ground and Common Ground. They do a wonderful job of explaining the situation that we're in with respect to soil. There's some other inspiring stories of people who have turned into ranchers and farmers because they believe in producing excellent food and they wanted to work with their hands. Search those out. There's no shortage of this. There's a lot of really, really great content out there on this. But ultimately, we have to find a way to feed our population effectively. We have to find a way to make it healthy. And I think we need to find a way where we involve more people. And as we press through this AI revolution that we are living through right now today, we just heard this week about layoffs at Amazon, 30,000 people, I believe. Layoffs at UPS, another 48,000 people. I see on LinkedIn all the time people saying you're not going to lose your job to AI. You're going to lose it to somebody who knows how to use AI better than you. That is patently false. AI is going to destroy jobs. It will create jobs too, but I am not convinced that it will create jobs at the same clip as it destroys jobs. And there are rumblings coming out of a lot of tech companies that they are building and developing AI in such a way as to replace up to 80% of their workforce. Now, if you think about that, what does that mean? As Amazon as the example, I believe they employ about 1.2 million people. And what I heard in the reporting was they're trying to replace between 70 and 80% of their workforce. That's between 600 and 900,000 people. We need to be connected to the soil. That's how you build resiliency. We all need food. Good quality food. We do not all need AI. And look, I'm a techno optimist. I think technology is great. I think we can embrace AI and we can move towards a more perfect union of adopting this technology while also, in some areas of our life, returning to our core valued past. And modifying that, obviously, to include all Americans. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the content, please do hit the like and subscribe button. And again, most importantly, have these conversations with your family members. I am really curious to hear what people think about talking about soil with their conservative Uncle Randy or their left wingnut Aunt Shirley. Do those things. Have those conversations. Do not be scared. This is not a time in history where we can be scared about having these conversations. We have to approach them head on. Talk to y'all soon.